Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. And as you said, I'd like to talk a little bit about using new cells, stem cells, for the treatment of Parkinson's disease, a disease that predominantly affects older people. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences at Cardiff, and I'm also the academic lead for a patient public involvement group called Brain Involve. And they're part of the Brain Repair and Intracranial Therapeutics unit at Cardiff University. And the Brain unit is a unit of neurologists, neurosurgeons, and neuroscientists trying to develop therapies for degenerative diseases that involve neurosurgery. So hopefully that will all become clear why that's relevant as I go through my talk. So firstly, what is Parkinson's disease? Many people think of Parkinson's disease as the one with the shakes, the one that gives people a tremor. And many people do, in fact, have a tremor with Parkinson's disease. It's a progressive movement disorder, but actually only about a third of patients experience tremor as part of that movement disorder. Most people experience slowness of movement, very rigid muscles, impairment to their balance, but they also experience a whole host of other changes. And it's really important to remember that Parkinson's disease is much more than a movement disorder. It can also affect cognitive function. It can affect people's mood in terms of anxiety and depression. It can be common in people with Parkinson's disease, as well as sleep and pain. So it's a really complex disorder, but it's very much simplified into a movement disorder. And I'm going to go against everything I've just said and simplify it into a very simple movement disorder for the purposes of this talk today. The problem with Parkinson's disease, as it is currently, is that we have treatments, but we don't have anything that will reduce the progression of the disease. We have something to treat the symptoms, but nothing that stops the disease from happening in its tracks. What you can see on the other side of my slide here is the brain. And the cause of Parkinson's disease is the loss of these substantia nigra neurons, these black pigmented neurons that reside in the base of the brain. And you can see that here. This is a slice through the brain. You can see this little factory. These are where the dopamine neurons reside, and they release dopamine up in this area called the putamen. And this is the release of dopamine which allows for movement to happen. And in Parkinson's disease, we see a reduction in the amount of neurons in this brain area, and this leads to a reduction of dopamine in the putamen. And that's a very simplistic approach to Parkinson's disease, but that's really how we look at trying to conceive the disease and the treatment strategies, because what patients can do to alleviate their symptoms is take more dopamine. They take dopamine agonists, which are drugs that stimulate dopamine receptors, or they can take a precursor to dopamine, which is called L-DOPA. And that treatment is brilliant because it replenishes the lost dopamine, but what happens as the disease progresses is that those drugs become less effective. Those drugs do not stop the progression of the disease, and they themselves cause more side effects. So that becomes treatment limiting. We can't increase the amount of drug, and we can't do anything to stop the progression of the disease. So an alternative strategy might be to put new cells into the brain that help restore that dopamine. So where we've got our dopamine factory and that is depleted of dopamine, what we can do is try and restore that dopamine by taking dopamine producing cells and transplanting them into the brain. Now, this isn't a new concept. This is something that was developed as early as the 1970s in rodents, and the first clinical trials happened in the 1980s. And this progressed using fetal tissue, so the product of elective terminations of pregnancy, which was dissected and transplanted into the brain. And this was successful. And this graph here from Kefalopoulou et al. Shows you that patients improved. These are two separate patients in case studies, and we can see that they improved over time, and they were actually able to come off their medication. But it's important to look at the timescales here. This took 5 years to get improvement, and then 10 years of medication-free time. So a monumental improvement in their disease state, but it took 5 years to occur. And in that time, they still had to take their medication. Unfortunately, what happened as a result of these trials were the reports of side effects from the transplants. And this happened in 2 studies in America and a study in Europe. Now, this was really problematic because this froze the field completely. And this meant that there was very little work being done until we could understand these side effects. And that was where I started doing a lot of research. And my early research was really focused on trying to understand the cause of these side effects. All of this work fed into a new clinical trial called TransEuro, which was led by Roger Barker in Cambridge. and Cardiff was part of it, along with labs in Sweden, Germany and France. And they've now transplanted patients, and we're eagerly awaiting the results of those transplants to see whether patients were improved without side effects, but also to see whether more patients were improved, because it was fairly inconsistent. Alongside this has been the generation of embryonic stem cells and stem cell technology. And importantly, we can now convert stem cells into dopaminergic neurons, which means we don't need to use fetal tissue. Also, there are some clinical trials that are ongoing. New York STEM and STEM PD are some 2 clinical trials which are about to be initiated looking at the transplantation of embryonic stem cells. But this is a bit of a checkered history for cell transplantation over a long period of time. So as I become involved in patient involvement, I wanted to ask the potential recipients of these transplants, people with Parkinson's disease, what they thought about cell transplantation. What about the risks of those side effects? Would they be willing to take part in a clinical trial, and what would they do as part of that trial, and what might worry them? Now, there's too much data here to show you everything, but this was done with Parkinson's UK, and we're writing it up at the moment. But really, the essence of what we found was that patients were primarily worried about long-term side effects. They were worried about them as an individual and whether it would work for them, because their disease is very unique to them and everyone experiences it differently. And also whether it would interact with their medication. This was important to me because despite this research, I'm predominantly a laboratory-based scientist. So I thought, well, can I take this and use this to influence my research direction and the questions I want to answer? Because actually none of these had been addressed in the lab so far. We'd done some preliminary work, but not with stem cells, only with fetal tissue. So that's what we've gone on to do. And actually it raised some very interesting questions, because even a very simplistic view of someone with Parkinson's disease is that they lose their dopamine, they have L-DOPA treatment, they get side effects potentially from that treatment, then we transplant, and they may continue with their L-DOPA treatment. When we do experiments in rats, we create dopamine loss and we transplant. So it's already an overly simplistic model. So the research that I did and continue to do now is looking at these transplants in the presence of levodopa. And it sounds like a very simple add-on, but actually it's been very interesting to do that. And the course of this work is, as I said, heavily influenced the TransEuro study, which is ongoing at the moment, and influenced the design of that clinical trial. What we found, in fact, is that the levodopa isn't bad for the graft. In fact, it might even be good. And the way that it's good is by helping turn those transplanted cells into the right kind of dopamine cells to produce the right kind of dopamine in the brain. Not right kind of dopamine, but dopamine produced in the right way to help alleviate the motor symptoms. What we also found was that a lot of the side effects from the L-DOPA can also be alleviated by the transplant. And that's important because it means that we may see more benefit than just improving symptoms. It may help with managing the treatment as well. We've also found that inflammation can occur in the brain around the transplant, so immunosuppression is a really important factor to be considered, and there's been a lot of debate in the field about how patients should be immunosuppressed and whether the brain is protected from the immune system or not. And it's a really interesting question that we're continuing to try and understand in more depth. We also looked at side effects, and we're continuing to look at these drug and graft-induced side effects and how they might interact. And importantly for patients, we're finding that they're typically, if they're induced by the transplant, they're milder than those induced by the drugs. And that's important risk-benefit analysis to be made by both neurologists and patients if they're considering a treatment like this. There may be intractable long-term effects from the graft, but they may be better than the long-term drug treatments that they're having to take, which they may be able to reduce in the longer term. So really trying to understand that trade-off. Really importantly though, I've shown a really simplistic model of a person with Parkinson's disease. And actually, someone with Parkinson's, as I showed you right at the beginning, is far more complex. There's lots of other neurons that are lost. They take lots of other different medication. And they also have the presence of a protein called alpha-synuclein in the brain. And we really don't understand functionally how that might interact with these drug treatments and with the transplants. We know that it probably doesn't cause a major loss of those cells. It doesn't kill the cells that we transplant, but will it affect the efficacy and the effect and the benefit that the patients receive? So we're still really trying to work to understand all of that, and that's a lot of the focus of my group. And what I really wanted to demonstrate here is how a lot of this work has been contributed to and fed to by people with Parkinson's disease. Even though I am a laboratory-based researcher, I've really been able to draw on the insights that you can get by talking to people with Parkinson's disease who have a real value to this kind of research. I also just wanted to highlight the fact that lots of different researchers at Cardiff are doing research into Parkinson's disease, just in case anyone that's interested is looking out. And these are some of the people who are doing some fantastic work on different aspects of Parkinson's disease. So we really do have a hub of lots of different expertise across the full plethora of activity around Parkinson's. And the last thing I'd like to do is thank my lovely group who produced and work incredibly hard to produce a lot of the data that I present and publish. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions about the research that I do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. So again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or just open your mic. But I'm going to just quickly ask one question. So I work on childhood neurodegeneration, and I was going to ask, do any of these groups, have they ever thought about possibly in the future looking at these kind of treatments for childhood neurodegenerative diseases? Because I know at the minute there aren't any, particularly the lysosomal storage diseases, that some are very much like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Have they ever discussed or considered this kind of treatment for them?
It's really interesting. I'm not aware of any research at the moment looking at the nature of doing this, but I think it would be fascinating to consider. I know that there has been a lot of work to consider using similar technology to try and infuse drugs into the brain of childhood diseases such as brain cancers, because alongside this there's been the generation of, alongside cell transplantation, there's been the generation of gene therapy. And I think for childhood diseases, gene therapy is probably a more likely avenue, but a lot of the technologies and a lot of the findings have been very synergistic between the cell transplantation and gene therapy fields. So while I don't think cell transplantation at the moment for these kind of disorders, because it's still a developing environment, is key, I think we're learning a lot that can influence the two fields.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? I think I saw someone earlier in the camera. Yeah.
Hi, it's Neil here, Emma from Cardiff.
Hello.
Hi. I think there's been recent reporting of an individual from the States who's had a stem cell transplant. Obviously, there's some sort of controversy around it because he personally funded it. But putting that to one side, from a kind of clinical science point of view, what's the sort of learning that's come out of that?
So for those of you that aren't aware, this is a very recent report within the last couple of weeks of a patient in the States who was transplanted with iPS cells, his own iPS cells. So they were taken, a sample of his cells were taken, they were developed in the lab and converted from stem cells into dopaminergic neurons and then transplanted in 2 phases. He had 2 surgeries in 2017 and 2018, if I remember correctly, into either side of his brain in stages. And the clinical report from that's just been released. I think it's very interesting because it's very, very new, the transplantation of stem cells. There have been some iPS cell transplants also conducted in Japan. In Japan, they use a slightly different approach. They're not using a patient's own iPS cells. They're using a bank of iPS cells that have been generated. So I think the concept that you can transplant somebody's own cells for neurological conditions is very exciting, because it was not so long ago that it was thought that that was unfeasible, that it was too difficult to quality control individual products. Because if you think about it, that your cells, if they're converted into dopamine neurons, they essentially become a new product each time. So quality assuring that is really challenging. And it was thought for quite a long time that that simply wasn't feasible, that it would be too costly to grow up cells into enough volume, because you need to transplant quite a lot of cells, and that it would be hideously expensive to do that. So I think the fact that the technology has moved on is very exciting. I think that the fact that this patient appears not to have had side effects from the transplant so far is also fascinating. I think we'll wait to see in the longer term how that evolves. But the fact that these transplants are happening, and there are some other groups in the States who are looking to develop this technology as well, I think it is moving the field forward, albeit there are some controversies surrounding the way that particular study was conducted.
We just had a question on the chat as well. It's from Emma Inel. How has COVID affected transplants?
That's a very interesting question. So for Parkinson's disease, I'm not aware that there are any ongoing trials there certainly aren't in the UK. The concept, I think, is unchanged, and I don't think it will stop the progression there. I think obviously some clinical trials have stopped, and that's across the world. For anything other than clinical trials into COVID, that has ceased. So that will cause delay in some areas in developing, firstly, the technology, because none of us are in the labs at the moment, so that's stopping everything moving forward. And it's also pausing clinical trials. And I think the knock-on repercussions of COVID will be quite widespread in other areas as money is refocused towards virology and infectious diseases, and potentially core funding will be not taken away but won't be prioritised for neurodegenerative diseases and other areas. And we're seeing a lot of active work from charities to try and ensure that doesn't happen, I think. But I think that's a very real problem, especially as finances are becoming more stretched as a result of COVID. Those minimal resources are going to be channeled towards particular areas, and we're already seeing that. There's been a huge release of monies towards grants for funding COVID-related research or virology and infectious diseases, and that is going by default to take focus away from other areas of research such as cancer and neurodegenerative diseases. So I don't think there's a dramatic impact right now. I think there will be repercussions that will be felt for us. I don't know what's happening with the Japanese clinical trial that's running at the moment and whether that's had to be put on hold as a result of COVID, because obviously they've had COVID in Japan also. So I think we will gradually see those issues. Parkinson's patients are an at-risk group because they have underlying condition, obviously, and many people with Parkinson's, by no means all, but many people with Parkinson's disease are also in the older category of the over 70s. But there are many people with Parkinson's who are younger and who will be very, very keen to ensure that this research doesn't get halted. But I think there is a risk.
Emma, can I ask you a really quick follow-up? Just because in the cancer world, lots of immunotherapies have been stopped because of COVID. So if there were patients who'd had transplants and then had immunosuppression afterwards, do you know if there are any in the UK or maybe a bit wider, and if their immunosuppression would have been stopped as a result of COVID?
That's really a good question. So I don't know the answer to that. I do know that for the patients that were in the TransEuro trial, the immunosuppression period was relatively short. So I believe that most of the patients are beyond their immunosuppression period. It's an interesting question. I don't know what the decision would be, and I suspect it would be based on the individual as to whether their immunosuppression would be stopped as a result, because some patients cope quite well with immunosuppression. Other patients have a very poor experience with immunosuppression. It's not easy to put patients on immunosuppression. The decision for TransEuro, I think, was to keep that to about 6 months. So it's a relatively short period of time. We still don't know whether that's enough. It's a compromise. Is that enough for the transplant to really mature and grow without the challenge of the peripheral immune system, but also not wanting to compromise the health of the patient for too long.